I also created some open source libraries. One of them is Vue-Validate. It's an alternative way to specify validations. Instead of doing them in the template, you can do those in your script, of the script part of your component. The other library that I made with Eduardo is a Vue global events, and this allows you to set up listeners to window or document the same way you would be doing it on components, which also means you can use the event modifiers and also toggle those events on and off if you just use VIF. But what I would like to speak about is my firstborn child, which is the Vue-Multiselect library, which is just a component. And it looks... did it mean nobody had been hearing me? OK, that's good. That it works. OK, so this is how it looks like. This is what it does. It's basically a searchable multiple selection tool with grouping, Ajax support, and so on. And here's a quote from my friend Chris about how it is to develop open source component libraries. And he said that maintaining one, it's like maintaining a component in the biggest application in the world, because eventually every use case will show up. And this is basically how it is in popular libraries. And this component has actually become quite popular, with more than 3,700 stars on GitHub and more than 1 million downloads in the last 12 months, which is quite surprising, but also makes me happy. But there is a downside to it, which is the issues. Yeah, and there are almost 70 still open, which makes me very sad. But I'm not that kind of bad developer. Those are not all just bugs. Most of them are actually just questions. People are wondering how to use the library. Maybe I did not such a good job at the docs, apparently. And there's also a lot of feature requests and some bugs. So let's see what I've learned so far when it comes to bugs. So most of the bugs don't really come from the code, as in there was just a typo or mistake in the code. No, most of the issues, the bugs, are related to user experience and come from the choices, the decisions that I made when I started doing it. And I figured when I was first designing it, I just imagined how it would work, and I just went with the idea. And then it turns out that it is quite confusing, because it did not follow the way people got used to selecting things. So my tip here is to just try to mimic, if possible, existing HTML elements and their behavior, or possibly look for popular patterns to solve the problem. And this is especially important, for keyboard control, not being able to use the keyboard or confusing people while doing it, while they try to use your component with the keyboard, is so bad. So another problem, which also leads to bugs, is not enough testing. And you could think I have 1,700 lines of test code, just tests for one drop-down component. It gives around 100 test cases, and this is also around 93% code coverage. It varies depending on some features that are merged and so on. But this is not enough. It's far from enough, and I don't have this security when I have to release a new version, and that's why it takes so long to release a new version, because every new feature adds another configuration option, which also adds another combination. And you know from math that combinations in this case will be growing exponentially. So just try to make sure, if you're developing a component like this, or a component in your app that you want to reuse in multiple places, that you try to cover most of those combinations. And possibly also introduce end-to-end tests, because unit tests at some point won't be good enough, probably. So, but design decisions. I made those back in 2016, when I was still just getting into Vue. So the biggest mistake, probably, I made was that I just created some local copies, and I think this is actually should actually be a quite obvious at this time that you shouldn't be doing cloning and like removing the reference to like an object or whatever, because like it introduces so many problems later. So I had to get rid of it, and instead the right solution is to always try to derive as much data as you can just from the props, and try to avoid local state unless it's only limited to user interface, as in whether something is open or not. But this probably should also be a prop. And then there are the styles. Who is actually using Vue here? Raise your hand. Wow, so many people. So scoped styles are pretty good for your application, but actually not really good for open source components, because they increase the specificity of the selectors, so it's much harder to override the styles. Then there's the part where by default those styles will be shipping together with your JavaScript, so it's not that easy to get rid of them if someone would like to use their own version. So instead, don't use scoping. Instead, apply a naming convention. You can also use CSS modules if you configure it so that you don't use the hashing at the end of the class. So it's quite easy to let the user override those styles. Also, make sure that the classes are structured flat so that you don't increase the specificity for some of those classes. Also, make sure to extract those CSS, and for that there are two plugins, one for Webpack and one for Rollup. Okay, another issue or decision that I made was trying to, because I wanted to make the components simpler, so I figured I would try to separate concerns using mixins. Like, hey, there is the pointer mixin, and it takes care of basically controlling and highlighting the elements when you click the arrow buttons. And that was basically the only thing that I could extract, which wasn't so strongly coupled to everything else. So I just got stuck with multi-select mixin, which is basically multi-select because you can't use it without the other parts. So it was like a complete failure. Instead, it's usually just better to try to extract components if you think your component just got bigger, and this is not only for open source, like it's for every component in your application. Another small tip, which might sound weird, is relying on focus state, so focus and blur events, to manage the active state, especially like in form elements. It might appear quite natural, like inputs, when they are focused, they are active, but when it comes to components, it requires you, like for every interaction around the component, it requires you to do some hacks or like bad practices, like forcing you to use mouse press prevent on every event so that you don't lose the focus on the element and close the dropdown, for example. So instead, try to use solutions like click outside, which if you Google it, if you click outside, there are like multiple solutions for that. And explicit user actions like pressing tab or pressing shift tab to move between the elements on the page. So enhancement. And lately I've been doing a small experiment, asking people that I met, people that I know already, how they would approach a very simple problem. So the experiment is something like this. We won't be doing it, but if you want to participate very quick, then you can do it. So the task is create a button component and make it so that the parent can specify what will be inside the component. And just imagine how you would design it, as in implement it. But then there is the second requirement, which is please have an arrow on the right side of the text. And then there is the next requirement. You can have an icon on the left side, on the right side, or on both sides, if this somehow makes sense. But then there is another requirement, which is make sure you can switch the whole content of the button and have a spinner inside. Okay, this already usually takes some work. And there is the last requirement, which is make also sure that you can have a spinner on both icons if you want, or replace it with something. So like 90% of the people that I ask this, or like let them follow this example, as in the experiment, they end up with something like this, which, well, escalated quite quickly, because it's like, why should the button actually care about icons, right? So what if I tell you that the right solution is just do something like this? Like, it just scales for, like, from the start. Like, you pass the text and you can actually pass whatever you want, like this. So, and this is the another advice. It's composition is usually better than configuration. Sure, in some cases the props will be good enough if you just know that you won't be changing those, you won't be introducing more. Actually, how many of you ended up with thinking about something like this? Oh, okay, if you fear about raising your hand, I'm not judging. I won't be closing my eyes because then I wouldn't know. Okay. So, composition and configuration. And in Vue, this means slots versus props. If you feel that you get too many props, too many configuration options, start thinking whether you could use a slot to basically remove the implementation details, like remove the requirements from this component to another component, maybe like to the parent. So, and this is something that I struggled with Multiselect, because then there were the feature requests, and those lead to feature creep. So, because more features mean more complexity, means just a harder time to maintain and contribute for others to the code. And for me too, like I'm barely knowing what is happening there at this point because I merged some pull requests a while ago. So the biggest lesson here is that I think it applies not only to open source components or libraries, but also into your application code. Instead of adding all the requirements to this one single component, one single module, try to provide an API that makes it possible for the outside code to basically implement this feature on top of your component. So instead of adding features, just make it possible for others to create those features themselves the way they want it. So that's the most important part. Okay, so this is how I perceive my users. Like 85% of them probably are happy, and this is just a guess, are happy with all the features that the component has, and there are like 15%, they just want to make me feel miserable because I have to say no to their feature requests, even if those feature requests make perfect sense, because I'm just too afraid that if I do those features, it will even get more complicated and harder to maintain. So I was wondering, like, what can I do to satisfy both of those groups? Because in the end, I want everyone to be happy. I want you to be happy. I'm trying my best. So we don't want to sacrifice the ease of use that there is currently. Like, many people said they like the component very much because you just drop it there, pass a few props, and it just works. So I want to stick to that. But then I also want to avoid the unnecessary complexity that will be there, and it's already there because of all the functionalities that we have and that is in the component. And I would like to make contributions easy so that other people can help with the maintenance. So I figured I will look into like other ecosystems and like how other people approach the problem. So I went to React and found React-Select. It's so impressive, especially how they handle accessibility, which is something my component has still to learn. So the biggest perks of React-Select is that it's basically the solution that just works. It's extremely customizable, has lots of features, but in the end, it's also somewhat opinionated, because you have to be opinionated if you are providing so many features, and the API surface is also quite wide. So I also looked into another approach, which is downshift. Who have heard about downshift? Oh, there is someone, 2 people. Okay. Oh, there's 3 people. Okay. This is a very cool approach because it doesn't provide you with any user interface. Like, it provides just the functionality, just the state that you can manage, that it will manage, and the methods. And that's why it has a very minimal API, but it's extremely flexible. Like, you can build everything, like anything on top of like autocomplete, GraphQL, fetched data that will land in a dropdown that you can search through and select. But it's something that you sadly have to do yourself. Thank you. Okay, so I figured I will just put those libraries on a spectrum. So on one end, we got features, we got large API surface, and the just works approach. And on the other side, here, we got the flexibility, simplicity, but also the approach where you have to do the work. So, and if we sum this up, it all boils down to where the edge cases are handled. So in the library or in your code. And if you're wondering, the current version of Vue-Multiselect is more on the left side, so closer to React Select. And what is your guess? Like, where is the best place to be on the spectrum? Any suggestions? Here? Downshift? Depends. Okay, well, maybe in the middle. Who is for the middle? Oh, there are many people. You're all wrong. That's because, like, in the middle, that's because in the middle is, like, it's not, it just works. It requires some work to make it work. And it also has quite complex API, but not that complex. And basically, it has the flows of both of those approaches. So my suggestion is we go this way. Yeah, if you think like, actually it does make sense. Yes, it does make sense. I just noticed that it's the same guy from the previous. Yeah. Okay, so say hi to the new version of Vue-Multiselect. And I'm not like trying to brag about the new version because it's not yet released. I just want to show you the approach that I will be taking. So first of all, we got the Vue-Multiselect core, which is kind of like downshift. It provides all the features, or maybe not all, but most of the core features. Exposes the state, methods, computer properties, basically everything. And you can build on top of it. And you can use it. It uses something called renderless components, which is basically like render props. And render props are scoped slots. And if there is something, if you never heard about slots, then you should like write it down and Google it on the Vue docs. It's like one of the best features ever. So you can, if you want to create a renderless component, this is what you have to do instead of a template. So you basically pass the whole this context into the slot so that the slot can just take everything it wants from the component and basically play with it. And then if you want to use it, it looks like this. So what we are doing here, I don't know if a pointer, but the first 2 arrows, like the first one is just the declaration of the component, and the second arrow points to a way that you can forward all the props and listeners to the core so that you can build a wrapper component that will just put all the props and listeners that you had set on it to the renderless core, so the renderless core can take care of managing those props and managing the listeners. So triggering events back to the parent component, not this one, but the parent component of this composition. And then inside the slot scope, you can take whatever properties from the core and just use them in your UI that comes down in the tree. So, but this is not all, because this is just one side of the spectrum, right? So what we can do now is, in the library, we also can provide a default composition, which is basically exactly, and looks and works almost exactly as the current version. So people that will be upgrading they will be probably have like a very smooth experience. Even if the API of the core changes, we can still do some bridging. So it should be quite okay. And but this is not all, because actually it looks more like this. And forgive me for the white background. It's a screenshot for the documentation. And those blocks are actually components for documenting the. The other speaker is apparently much better. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I needed that. So what you can do additionally, because the composition is just a composition of smaller components that will also ship with this next version. For example, the options list, the wrapper, which is the clickable part, the value, so displaying elements that are selected, and the input. And you can replace any of those elements with your own implementation and just connect with the slot, because those are also in the slot of the default composition. But then those smaller components also have slots. So what I can do is, when you're passing, you can pass slots to the slots that other components wrapped inside a slot can expose to you. So it doesn't make sense. I wanted to put a man with exhibit, but forgot about it. So this is what you can do. And what I hope is the gain from the migration to the new version, releasing the new version and this approach entirely, is that new components can be created on top of the core, like, for example, a material version of the dropdown. And it's not just my library, but if other libraries also use this approach, it will also be possible there. And they can be shared like outside of my library, so I don't have to maintain them. And then there's also another benefit where people can create those smaller parts of the component and just switch it. Or maybe, and this is something I think I could be merging into my library, so that there are just a few smaller parts. Like, for example, if you want to have your list have not just like a vertical selection, but maybe like some buttons, checkboxes. I don't know. People want to have tables there, so I don't know. And also, in the end, I hope that by clearing the core from the unnecessary features and moving them to, for example, to the list, so that the list can handle the grouping, so that if you don't need the grouping and you would like just to have a very simple list, you can just use a simple list instead of the one that handles all the groups and so on. So the current status is pre-alpha. I don't know what this means, but I haven't released it, so. But the good thing is that it works. But there will be changes. Like, I still need to move some things around. But the concept is solid, I think so. And you can try it out on the V3 branch. That's the repo. If you have any feedback, it's much appreciated. I will be standing there, also for questions. You can also submit issues or ping me somewhere to talk about it. Also, bonus. If you're thinking about releasing an open source component, this is a very good library, as in repo, created by Chris Fritz, which includes most of those good practices that I already mentioned, like with the styles, and also with all the configuration that you need to release a package, release a component, so that it is very easy to publish and for other people to import selected parts of it and so on. And this will be it. Thank you very much.